Do you need an AI roadmap? I'll show you the exact 8 steps that I'm using with my clients to assess whether or not a given AI process or AI use case makes sense to implement. So let's get started and I'll show you exactly how I use it. All right, the 8 steps are neatly laid out in this canvas that you see, and it's really all divided into 3 different dimensions. We always start with the core problem at heart. So why are we doing this? Why do we even care about this? Then we look at how exactly we would implement something like that. And lastly, as always, this is business, we're going to look at how much will that cost us. So let's get into each one of those 8 fields, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the things that you need to consider in order to determine whether or not it's a good idea. Step 1, the business problem. So this is really something that we always have to ask ourselves at the beginning of the process. Why are we even doing this? What is it that we're trying to change? Or what is it that we're facing as a problem? Who is impacted? Is it an employee? Is it some of the customers? So what's the thing that if you went into solving it would change in the end? Always important to also consider is, how often does something like this happen? Is this just a once a quarter type of thing and it takes an hour to fix? Probably not as important as when something that happens daily, multiple times, and it takes a huge amount of time and a lot of employees to solve those things. You'll have to weigh one against the other. Then we go into assuming we're solving this problem. What do we get out of it? What goal are we trying to achieve in the end? What are some of the improvements that we're trying to get to? Some quantifiable savings, either in time, in terms of time, or in terms of money, but then also things like customer happiness, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction. So things that you can measure sometimes, but not always very well. Those also factor into your goals. And lastly, of course, who benefits from it? Is it employees? Is it customers? And to assess the business value, you go and you say, in terms of return on investment, how high would that be? Is it fairly low? Not something that would give a lot of return, or is really something that will pay off over time? How important is it in terms of the core business strategy? So if it's something that's at the core of what your business is doing, and it happens a lot like we established before, it's definitely business critical, and you want to consider that much more than when it's just a nice to have thing that might save you a minute or two every day. And then to quantify those things a little bit better, we want to know how we measure success. And that always comes in the shape of 1 to 3 key performance indicators, or KPIs. And really important, you want to set a baseline. So you want to say, today we're at 13% and we want to get to 18% at the end of the process. Why is this important? Because in the end, if you put a lot of effort into a new process with AI, you want to know, was it worth it in the end? And you want to know where you are in this process, where you started and where you want to get to. And in terms of frequency, how often you want to check in and measure that. And we're already on to the second dimension, the how dimension. So here, this is where we're trying to figure out how we're implementing the process. And it all always starts with data. One really crucial important thing that you have to consider is how critical is that data in terms of personally identifiable information. That's especially relevant in the EU, but of course in every jurisdiction, in most countries, there are some laws that protect from misuse or abuse of personally identifiable information. So just go real quick through and determine, is the data that you're trying to use with AI, is that publicly available? Something that's core to your business that you wouldn't share with outsiders, but it's not necessarily personally identifiable. It can also be personally identifiable and anonymized. You'd have to put in some work to get there, or it's really personally identifiable, in which case, of course, you have to take much more precaution to protect that kind of data in the process, whether you use AI or not, of course. Some other things you should think about here also is the data that you want to work with. Do you have it all available? Is it in the systems that you are working with day to day? Is it just one system? Is it a whole bunch of systems? Is the quality sufficient? And that's really one point that I'm always honing into, because oftentimes, You have systems that run over years and years and sometimes decades. So you want to think about, is the quality of the data sufficient to work with for the purposes of AI? That's something you only figure out sometimes down the road when you're already in the process of testing or implementing it. But it's good to consider that ahead of time as well. Okay, and now smack in the middle of the canvas, we're defining our AI approach. One dimension again here to consider is how much automation will you let the AI do in the process? And so there's three different types. One is autonomous, where essentially you say, you know what, I'll let AI do everything autonomously. I don't need to take a look at it because it's not very risky, or it's something that I either have trust in the AI to do, or something that I know will work, but we've tested it ahead of time. That's autonomous. Probably rare to do that unless it's a very uncritical type of data. Then you have assistive, where the AI does a bunch of work, and in the end, you get a human in the loop and you say, yeah, that looks good, or no, actually, we need to do it again, or we need to change something, or we need to reject the whole thing. And lastly, that's often the case with research, where the AI prepares something and suggests a course of action just to inform you. And so those are the three different ways you could automate your process with AI. And just like with the AI implementation, we also want to determine, how do we implement this process in the organization? Is it something that you roll out to the complete organization at once? Or rather, which is what I would recommend, you do a small pilot for a limited period of time and you see with that, is the process working as intended? Another way to do that is with a minimum viable product. But here you want to figure out, if you strip down the scope to just a minimally viable product, what does viability really mean in that context? So when is something that's stripped down still representative of the thing that you want to build in the end? So the difference between the first and the second, the pilot really is something that you do with a limited scope, and the MVP would be something that you do with minimal or limited functionality. So two slightly different things. To contrast that, complete implementation is something that you build out completely and you roll it out. The second thing to consider here is it something that you can build in-house? Do you have the resources? Do you have the competence? Do you have the availability of people to develop an AI solution completely in-house? Or rather, is it something that you purchase out on the market? You buy a piece of software or a tool, a SaaS product? Or lastly, will you collaborate with an outside organization to implement something within your organization? And now we're down to the third dimension, which is, how much will that cost you? One, determined by the complexity that you put into a project like that. So we talked about the AI approach before, and that will determine your technical complexity. So is that something that's very complex? You would give it a score of 5, or is it something that's fairly simple? You give a score of 1. Just as important, we just talked about that, is how complex will it be to roll this out in your organization? How much will you have to train them? How will people be bought into the situation? So a couple of factors that you need to consider there. That also, of course, depends on how many people are impacted by this new process. And then lastly, how complex is the data? Is it all available and nicely structured and ready to be used, or is it unstructured? Do you have to purchase it first? Is it distributed? How's the quality? So you will assign a score from 1 to 5 in order to assess the complexity of the data and the information that you're working with. And finally, something to always consider with a project like that. And I say always because usually you consider risks when it's already too late. And when you didn't think about risks and it's already too late, this is when it gets really, really costly, which is the reason why we see this in the bottom dimension. How much will it cost us? So think ahead of time. Do you have any compliance risks that apply to your specific country and the regulations and laws that you have? Do you have any risks with regard to privacy? The data that you're using, is it something like full names and birthdays and credit cards, or is it data that is not private at all and that you can use without a second thought? And then lastly, if you shift a major process, is there any risk with regards to your reputation on the market, with your customers, your reputation with your employees sometimes. So something to consider ahead of time. And while you're thinking about those things, you probably also want to think about backup plans and how transparent you want to be when rolling out a solution like that, both internally within your organization and also externally. All right, that was a lot of talk. Now let's look at a specific example of a sales organization and how they assessed whether to use AI to a much higher extent to change the way they work. This was a sales organization of about 80 different sales reps. And just to mention some of the problems they were facing, of course, the whole process was perceived as a bit inefficient and fragmented, especially by management. It was heavily dependent on individuals. And that all led to the fact that they perceived pretty high costs in terms of how the pipeline was structured and how many leads they were missing as a result of that. Affected roles there, sales, of course, the sales reps, their managers, sales ops, marketing as an adjacent function. So it's always important to consider who do you work with, who might be affected by that. And then, of course, management overall. So it's sales, which means it's urgent and it's frequent. You sell every day. If the sales process is not working well, then you have a bit more of an urgency than when other processes don't work well. What do we want to get out of it? After a bit of workshopping, we figured out that if the lead process can be qualified a bit better and you can have personalized offers, then the whole pipeline would work better. That would also help forecasting sales. So if the leads are tracked across the whole cycle, that helps with forecasting. CRM usage would go up, which is something that came out of a different process. And finally, also the sales cycles would be shortened. One benefit that I thought was important and interesting also was not thinking about the organization, but thinking about sales. So they're the ones that are affected. So you'd have to think about how much workload can you take away from them for them to focus on the thing that matters to them, which is selling and not working with pipeline management and lead generation and lead scoring and all of that. If this all worked, the return would be huge, so 4 stars at least, and of course, strategic importance is significant in an organization that is sales driven. To quantify that, we want to get a sales cycle duration from where it's right now, which is 40 days, to about 25 days. The rate from lead to opportunity should go from 15 to 25%. And then something that we'll talk about later is they'll roll it out as a pilot, which means there is a control group. So you'll have a group that will work with a new process and another group that will work sort of as a control. And so you want to measure both against each other. And for that, they determined an 8% uplift for the control group to the group which is using the AI process. So just to remember, we talked about the what, right? What do we want to do in terms of problem, in terms of solving that problem? And now let's talk about how we want to do that. Sales is all about CRM data. So the data is mostly trapped either or available in the CRM tool. Those are emails, call logs, meeting notes, but also inbound calls that they don't have with salespeople. You have all the marketing data in there, or in an adjacent system, I should say, not in the CRM system. And then you have company data like firmographics and information about the industry. The approach was twofold. One is using LLMs, things like the technology behind ChatGPT, for example, where you can summarize emails, draft suggestions as responses. I'm sure you've seen tools that do something like that. Having the AI, the LLM, take auto-generated meeting notes, and then also having the LLM generate best next actions as a recommendation. So assuming all the touch points that the sales rep had with the customer, what would be the next best action for that person? Aside from the LLM, and that's important because when we talk about AI nowadays, we always talk about generative AI, such as with tools with ChatGPT or Claude or some of the other tools. But AI also has other manifestations, which, for example, is just traditional forecasting, traditional machine learning. So those are things that can still be used nowadays. Lead scoring is something that is well established in tools that sales organizations use, and so is churn prediction. So I think the power in this would be combining sort of these newer approaches like LLMs with traditional machine learning. Degree of automation, of course, this is not an autonomous system that does everything itself. I think that's something that is aspirational, maybe that the organization would get to in a few years. No, but in all seriousness, this is using a lot of assistive automation where the AI prepares something and you have to sign it off as an employee, as a sales rep, and say like, yep, send out that email, or yep, please do summarize those meeting notes. Or it's recommending, like I said, a best next action to the sales rep, and it's up to them to take that up and do something with it or not. And lastly, and that's probably the most critical part in this whole canvas, it's thinking about how to roll this out. So one way is to do it with a small MVP that just does email summarization, lead classification, something that can be developed, assuming the resources are available in-house, and after which you would know, is this something that would work for us? It's also an option to say like, hey, tools like HubSpot have functionality like Breeze or Salesforce Einstein that already do a lot of those things. So instead of developing them as an organization, you could just buy those or buy those additional add-ons to the CRMs that you're already using, and that would skip this initial phase. The danger is that you don't have much control over how well that works. So here you'd have more control, takes more effort. Here's something that you get much quicker time to action than when you have to develop it yourself. The suggestion was to go with a test phase where you do a pilot with a selected sales team and to have a control group to counteract seasonal and other market distortions. Why is that important? Because if you throw AI on just one group and you don't have any baselines that you can compare it to, sales is inherently seasonal, then you might get effects that you measure that are not attributable to the AI, but just to the fact that it's summer where less things are happening than in the spring. And then if everything was successful on all the KPIs that we saw before were reached, and this would be rolled out within the next 6 to 12 months. In order to manage something like that, you need a whole bunch of people. You need a project manager, someone who works with the IT systems and the IT integrations, an AI specialist. Those, by the way, can all be the same person. It doesn't have to be separate roles, but you need people with those skills in-house, or you'll have to get them outside of your organization. You need a change manager, potentially, that manages the whole change process over those 12 months. You potentially, depending on the data you work with, you might need someone who has their eye on data protection. And then, of course, important during this whole process, the pilot and the rollout, how are you going to handhold the people on the sales team? And then later on, the entire sales organization and the company as a whole. In terms of complexity, we went through and assessed the 3 different dimensions. Data complexity, there's a lot of data coming in from CRM, from the marketing data, potentially from call logs. So you'd have to bring that all together, merging structured and unstructured data. I would give it a 4 out of 5. The technical implementation is fairly complex. We have multiple environments. So this is a 5 out of 5. And again, because this is a massive shift in how people work, you would have to put a whole bunch of effort into the organizational change. And finally, risk. I don't think reputation is much of an issue here because most things happen internally. Compliance, there's not a lot to think about here. This was specific to this country and jurisdiction. Again, this might change with every country. The data quality was pretty good, so I'll give it a 4 out of 5. And in terms of data privacy, there weren't a lot of personally identifiable information in there or GDPR concerns. So this was a 4 out of 5, meaning not very risky in terms of the risk. So this is something you can do in your organization. You pack the relevant people into a meeting room and you work out each of those 8 fields of the AI canvas. Or this is something that you get an outside consultant into. That's something I do with organizations as well. So if you need help, definitely let me know and I can help you through that process as well. Again, take about half a day to a day because you want to think through a whole bunch of different dimensions. And at the end, you have a pretty good goal that you can see like, hey, we have a problem that's urgent, happens frequently, is strategic, has an ROI, and actually has not always the biggest risks. You have to weigh one against the other. And so this could be the basis of a decision where you say, yep, we're going to go with it. Or no. In that spirit, I hope this was useful. You have a QR code up here where you can get this canvas as a template. And if you need any help with that, let me know, and I'll see you next time.